Depression-era meat stretchers, beef and oatloaf. In the hardest years of the Great Depression, when the dinner table was more often bare than bountiful, home cooks got creative with what little they had. Beef and oatloaf wasn't just a recipe, it was an act of quiet resilience. With 1 pound of ground beef and a scoop of oats, families found a way to stretch supper far enough to reach every hungry plate at the table. This loaf didn't pretend to be fancy. It wore its frugality with pride. Ground beef, mixed with rolled oats, never the quick kind, was seasoned with salt, pepper, and whatever scraps a kitchen could spare. An onion if you had one. A splash of milk if the cow had been generous. Some added a spoonful of ketchup or a pinch of dried herbs for flavor. But nothing went in that didn't serve a purpose. The oats weren't just filler. They absorbed flavor and held everything together like culinary glue.
The oatmeal helps to stretch the meat and make the meatloaf soft and moist.
Once mixed, the meat was shaped into a loaf and baked until the edges turned crisp and the top wore a proud little glaze of whatever sauce was on hand, often just more ketchup, thinned with water. The result was a dense, savory dish that carved like meatloaf and fed like a feast. Sliced thin, it went further. Paired with mashed turnips or boiled carrots, even a crust of bread on the side, it became a full meal with dignity intact. What makes this dish endure isn't just its taste, it's the memory of mothers stretching paychecks and grandmothers turning pantry odds and ends into something that felt like Sunday dinner on a Tuesday night. Today, when food waste is high and grocery bills are higher, this Depression-era staple offers a humble reminder that good food doesn't have to be expensive. Sometimes it's just about knowing how to make the most of what's in your hands and stretching it with heart. Victory Garden Skillet, ground beef with canned tomatoes and cabbage. Back when wartime posters told families to do your part, American kitchens became quiet battlegrounds of ingenuity. The Victory Garden Skillet was one such triumph. Not a grand feast, but a humble, filling skillet supper born from backyard plots, tin can pantries, and ration book reality. It took whatever you had, especially cabbage, tomatoes, and a bit of precious ground beef, and turned it into something warm, nourishing, and proudly homegrown.
This is an easy budget meal stretching that 1 pound of ground beef to feed 4 hungry people.
Cabbage was king in those days. It grew fast, stored well, and filled the plate. Paired with ground beef, it took on a whole new purpose, stretching protein and soaking up flavor. The base of the skillet started simple. Brown the beef in a pan with chopped onion if you had one. Let the fat render, then toss in shredded cabbage and a can of stewed tomatoes. That tomato juice, seasoned with salt, pepper, and perhaps a pinch of sugar or vinegar, would simmer down into a rustic sauce, binding everything together. Some home cooks added rice or diced potatoes to bulk it up. Others swore by a splash of Worcestershire or even a spoonful of bacon grease saved in a tin above the stove. The dish was a chameleon. It could be spooned over bread, served in bowls, or eaten straight from the skillet if cleanup needed saving. What mattered most wasn't perfection, it was practicality. Kids ate it without too much complaint, and adults knew they were doing the best they could with what they had. It's not hard to see why this dish has quietly persisted in some family kitchens. It's fast, uses staples most folks still keep around, and has that rib-sticking, someone loves you kind of comfort. In a time when fast food is faster and slow food has become an Instagram trend, the Victory Garden Skillet stands as a simple reminder. The best meals aren't always beautiful. Sometimes they're just hot, honest, and made with care, and that's plenty. Beef and bread, crumb casserole. Before there were boxed mixes and branded helpers, there was the casserole dish. Deep, sturdy, and endlessly forgiving. The beef and breadcrumb casserole is a relic from the era when cooking was less about recipes and more about resourcefulness. When meat was scarce and the end pieces of bread were too stale for sandwiches, frugal homemakers turned to this filling, family-sized bake, to stretch their groceries and fill the house with the smell of something hearty. The beauty of this casserole lies in its simplicity. Start with ground beef, browned slowly in a cast iron skillet, maybe with a chopped onion if one was available. Once cooked, the meat was set aside while a mixture of stale bread, torn or cubed, was soaked in milk or water to soften. This wasn't waste, this was strategy. The bread would expand, absorb flavor, and transform into a soft, custardy base. The beef was folded back in, along with a beaten egg or two for binding, and perhaps a touch of mustard, Worcestershire, or leftover broth for depth. Every household had its own version, shaped more by what was on hand than any written instruction. Once mixed, the whole thing was pressed into a greased baking dish and topped with buttered crumbs, often from the same loaf that had gone stale. Into the oven it went until the top turned golden and crisp, the middle firm but tender, and the aroma unmistakably that of home. It didn't need a fancy sauce or exotic spice to be loved. It was filling, honest, and reliable. For many families, this casserole was a weeknight workhorse, feeding 5 or 6 with minimal fuss and maximum stretch. Today, it might be mistaken for something rustic or artisanal, but to those who grew up on it, it's simply what dinner looked like when you made the most of every last crumb. In a world where we chase convenience but still crave comfort, maybe it's time this casserole made a quiet comeback, one buttery bite at a time. Meat Ration Pie, savory ground beef cobbler. During World War II, when meat was rationed and butter came in short sticks and smaller quantities, home cooks had to get clever if they wanted to put something warm and filling on the table. Meat Ration Pie was one such invention, less of a luxury and more of a solution. It took a small amount of ground beef, stretched it with pantry staples, and topped it with a biscuit crust that turned golden in the oven. It wasn't about indulgence, it was about stretching every scrap into something that felt like a proper meal. The filling was frugal and flexible. Ground beef, often just half a pound or less, was browned with onion and bulked up with vegetables like carrots, potatoes, or peas, depending on what you had or grew. A little flour and broth or milk turned it into a light gravy, giving the illusion of richness. Some recipes called for a splash of tomato juice or a spoonful of ketchup for added body, but there was no fixed formula. This dish wore whatever the pantry could spare. The biscuit topping was a quick dough, mixed by hand and dropped over the bubbling filling in rough spoonfuls. It wasn't fussy, but when baked, those biscuits rose and browned into a crust that was equal parts comforting and practical. It gave the dish structure, warmth, and the satisfying illusion of something a little more extravagant than it really was. Served straight from the baking dish, it fed a family without fanfare, but with plenty of heart. It was the kind of meal you ate gratefully, knowing there wasn't much to go around, but somehow there was enough. In today's world of puff pastry and pre-made everything, Meat Ration Pie reminds us of a time when cooking meant making do and doing it well. It's proof that with a bit of flour, a little meat, and a whole lot of intention, you could still bake up something that tasted like care. Tin can hash, beef, canned veggies, fried in bacon grease. If there was ever a dish that defined making do, it was tin can hash. Built for lean times and empty shelves, this skillet supper was a testament to the creativity of home cooks who refused to let hard times steal dinner from the table. With just a little ground beef, a handful of canned vegetables, and the all-important flavor boost of bacon grease saved from breakfast past, tin can hash turned rations and scraps into something warm, filling, and surprisingly satisfying. The process was simple, and that was the point. You'd start by heating a cast iron skillet, adding a good spoonful of bacon grease, often stored in an old coffee can or mason jar on the back of the stove. Once it shimmered, in went the ground beef, browning and sizzling until the kitchen smelled like something hopeful. Whatever canned vegetables were on hand, corn, green beans, diced potatoes, even peas or carrots, were drained and added in next. Sometimes there'd be a chopped onion or a bit of garlic, but often it was just the basics. The magic was in the skillet. Everything cooked together, the bacon fat coating each bite in smoky richness that made even bland canned corn taste indulgent. The mixture crisped on the bottom, forming those golden brown bits that got scraped up with a spoon and fought over at the table. Seasoning was salt and pepper, maybe a dash of hot sauce if someone had squirreled some away. Tin can hash wasn't fancy, but it was honest. It fed families when fresh food was scarce and money was tighter than the lids on those old canning jars. For many, it was the meal of Tuesday nights and post-payday Fridays, something to fill the belly and carry you to tomorrow. And somehow, in that simple mix of grease, beef, and pantry vegetables, there was love. Maybe it's time to bring back tin can hash, not just for nostalgia's sake, but to remember how good food can come from the humblest places, especially when it's made with care. Porcupine meatballs, beef plus rice cooked in tomato sauce. Porcupine meatballs were never meant to impress, but they always managed to. Born in mid-century kitchens that balanced tight budgets with big appetites,
Porcupine Meatballs, a budget recipe that's been around since or before the Great Depression.
these quirky little meatballs got their name from the way bits of rice poked through the surface after simmering. Spiky and soft all at once, like comfort food in a funny hat. They were a staple on weeknight tables and church potlucks alike, beloved for being filling, flavorful, and shockingly easy to make. The base was as humble as it gets. Ground beef mixed with uncooked white rice, usually long grain, plus an egg to hold it together, and a little onion or garlic for good measure. The rice would cook inside the meatball, slowly absorbing flavor and softening into something tender but toothsome. Some cooks added a spoonful of Worcestershire or dried herbs if they were feeling fancy, but the magic happened in the pot. Once rolled into balls, not too big, not too small, they were nestled into a pan of simmering tomato sauce, often made from canned tomato soup or stewed tomatoes thinned with water or broth. Covered and left to bubble gently on the stove or in the oven, the meatballs would swell slightly as the rice cooked and poked through, giving them their signature porcupine look. It was a small kitchen miracle, meat and starch cooked at the same time, in one pot, with no need for sides, unless you had some bread to sop up the sauce. Porcupine meatballs were cheap to make, hard to mess up, and somehow always tasted like someone cared. They filled the house with the smell of tomato and beef, the kind of scent that said dinner was ready and everything was going to be okay. In today's world of 30-second meals and meal delivery apps, these meatballs feel almost revolutionary. Gentle reminder that real food doesn't need much. Just a little meat, a little rice, and a lot of love simmered slow. Creamed beef on toast, SOS, but make it homey. To some, it was called SOS, a nickname too colorful to spell out in polite company. To others, it was creamed beef on toast, a dish that landed somewhere between survival food and kitchen classic. What began as a staple in military mess halls made its way into American homes where clever cooks softened its rough edges and turned it into something worth remembering.
Cream chip beef is rich and a definite comfort meal.
This wasn't just salty rations on white bread, it was comfort, hot from the skillet, served with a side of nostalgia. At its core, the dish was built for efficiency. Ground beef, lean if you had it, fatty if you didn't, was browned in a pan, often with diced onions for flavor and bulk. A little flour was sprinkled in, stirred until the beef was coated and the grease transformed into a roux. Then came the milk, added slowly to create a thick, savory gravy that clung to every morsel. Some home cooks doctored it with black pepper, garlic powder, or even a pinch of nutmeg. Others poured in a splash of canned evaporated milk or added frozen peas when the budget allowed. The toast was simple, usually white bread, lightly crisped in the oven or browned in a dry skillet. When spooned over the toast, the warm beef mixture soaked into the slices just enough to soften the edges while still holding structure. It wasn't elegant, but it was satisfying in a way only warm, carb-laden meals can be. For many post-war families, this was Tuesday night dinner, cooked fast and eaten gratefully. It made a little meat go a long way, filled the kitchen with the smell of something savory, and always seemed to get second helpings. Today, it might not grace the cover of a food magazine, but it's still standing quietly in the background of countless family memories. Creamed beef on toast reminds us that even a dish born from necessity can become beloved when it's served with a little care, and maybe just the right amount of cracked pepper. Stuffed bell peppers with white rice and ketchup glaze. Stuffed bell peppers were the kind of dish that looked like a celebration, even when money was tight. Bright green, or sometimes red if you were lucky, peppers stood tall in a casserole dish, filled to the brim with a mixture of ground beef, white rice, and pantry seasonings. It was a Depression-era favorite that lingered well into the 1950s and beyond, not just because it was budget-friendly, but because it felt like real effort, a little bit of showmanship in a time when people needed to feel like something was special.
Stuffed bell peppers. This recipe is delicious.
The filling was usually yesterday's rice, fluffed up with a fork, and mixed with browned ground beef. Sometimes an egg was added to help it all stick together, along with chopped onions, a shake of salt and pepper, and maybe a splash of Worcestershire if the bottle wasn't empty. Once the peppers were hollowed out, tops sliced clean, seeds scooped, they were packed full with the meat and rice mixture, pressed down so every bite held together. But the part most people remember, that sweet, tangy ketchup glaze. A generous squirt of ketchup was spread over the tops of each pepper before baking, often thinned with a little water or tomato juice to help it caramelize. It bubbled in the oven and seeped into the rice, giving every bite a nostalgic zing. The peppers would soften as they baked, becoming tender but never mushy, their skins wrinkling just a bit at the edges, a sign they were ready. Served with mashed potatoes or slices of buttered bread, these stuffed peppers filled the plate and the belly. They were hearty, warm, and surprisingly elegant for something built from such modest ingredients. Today, you'll find gourmet versions with quinoa and artisanal sauces, but the old-school version still holds its charm. Because sometimes, all you really need is ground beef, leftover rice, and a bottle of ketchup to turn an ordinary pepper into something unforgettable. Homemakers beef ring. Beef and biscuit dough molded in a bundt pan. The Homemakers beef ring wasn't just a dinner, it was a centerpiece. In the mid-20th century, when dinner parties were hosted in linoleum kitchens and table settings were timed to match the 6 o'clock news, this dish served up both sustenance and spectacle. Made with ground beef, biscuit dough, and a trusty bundt pan, the beef ring was equal parts thrifty and theatrical, perfect for the ambitious homemaker who wanted to impress without breaking the bank. At its heart, the dish was a savory beef filling wrapped in golden, fluffy biscuit dough. The meat mixture was simple: browned ground beef, sautéed onions, maybe a diced bell pepper, or a handful of shredded cheese if you had it to spare. Some versions included a splash of tomato soup or a spoonful of mustard to keep it moist and add flavor, but it never strayed far from its frugal roots. The biscuit dough, either homemade or from a can, depending on time and mood, was rolled out, pressed into the bundt pan, and filled with the beef mixture before being folded over to form a sealed ring. Baked until puffed and golden, The ring would emerge from the oven looking almost festive. Flipped onto a serving platter, it held its shape like a savory crown ready to be sliced and served in hearty wedges. Sometimes it was garnished with parsley, sometimes with nothing at all. It didn't need much. It was warm, filling, and undeniably clever. A complete meal you could cut like cake. This dish told a story of homemakers who balanced style with savings, of kitchens that ran on practicality and pride. It turned an ordinary pound of beef and a bit of dough into something that felt special. Today, we might raise our eyebrows at meat baked in a bundt pan, but in its time, the beef ring was brilliant. And honestly, still is. Sometimes the smartest dishes are the ones that make something beautiful out of the everyday. Budget beef, stroganov, ground beef plus sour cream plus egg noodles. Long before beef stroganoff became the creamy indulgence served in upscale restaurants, it took on a thriftier form in American kitchens, one that swapped sirloin for ground beef, heavy cream for sour cream, and still managed to taste like something far fancier than it was.
Beef stroganoff made a very quick, very tasty, delicious meal.
Budget beef. Stroganoff was a mid-century weeknight savior, the kind of recipe clipped from the back of a soup label, or scribbled onto an index card and tucked into a metal recipe box for safekeeping. The dish began, as so many economical meals did, with ground beef, browned in a skillet with chopped onions, and maybe a few mushrooms, fresh if you had them, canned if you didn't. It formed the savory base. A bit of flour was sprinkled in to soak up the juices, followed by a splash of broth or even bouillon dissolved in water. Then came the magic, a generous dollop of sour cream stirred in just before serving, turning the mixture into a silky, tangy sauce that clung to everything it touched. Served over wide egg noodles, the sauce coated each ribbon like velvet. The noodles soaked up the beefy, creamy flavors, turning a modest pound of meat into something that could feed a whole family with a little extra left for lunch boxes the next day. It was rich without being expensive, comforting without being complicated. What made budget beef stroganoff so beloved wasn't just the taste. It was the way it made you feel like you were eating well, even when money was tight. It had that air of elegance borrowed from Russian aristocracy, filtered through a can of cream of mushroom soup, and a Depression-era sense of practicality. Even now it holds up. It's still fast, still filling, and still delicious in that way only nostalgia-laced comfort food can be. One bite, and you're back at a Formica kitchen table, listening to the hum of the fridge and the clatter of forks against Carrel plates. Where dinner didn't need to be fancy, it just had to be made with love. Sloppy Joe's older cousin, ketchup-free savory version. Before Sloppy Joe got sweet and tangy with bottled ketchup and became a staple of school cafeterias, there was a heartier, more savory version that lived in cast-iron skillets and hand-me-down cookbooks. Sloppy Joe's older cousin wasn't about sugar or shortcut sauces. This was a meat sandwich meant to satisfy, using real ingredients and pantry staples, and built on the flavors of onion, garlic, broth, and spice. More Sunday supper than weeknight mess. This version started with ground beef, browned slowly with chopped onion, and maybe some green pepper, cooked until the edges caramelized and the pan smelled like something real was happening. Garlic followed, minced or powdered. Then came the building blocks of flavor. A spoonful of tomato paste instead of ketchup, maybe a bit of Worcestershire sauce or a splash of vinegar for tang. Some recipes called for beef broth, letting it simmer down until the mixture thickened into something rich and spoonable but never runny. A dash of mustard powder, a pinch of paprika. These weren't fancy ingredients, just what the pantry gave. The result wasn't as sweet as the version that would come later in the 1960s, but it was undeniably comforting. It clung to the bread like a good filling should, soaking in just enough to make the sandwich soft but not soggy, served on hamburger buns, leftover dinner rolls, or even a slice of plain sandwich bread folded in half. It was humble, satisfying, and endlessly adaptable. Families didn't call it gourmet, but they knew it was good. It filled the kitchen with warmth and stretched a pound of meat just far enough. This version of the Sloppy Joe wasn't about nostalgia or marketing. It was just dinner, made with what was on hand and served with care. In a world full of sugary sauces and shortcuts, it might be time for Sloppy Joe's older cousin to make a comeback. No ketchup required, just a good skillet, a little thyme, and the kind of flavors that don't need a label to be loved. Meatloaf with evaporated milk and cracker crumbs. Meatloaf is the kind of dish that carries 100 different memories, but this version, made with evaporated milk and crushed cracker crumbs, holds a special place in the hearts of those who grew up with frugal, no-nonsense cooking. It wasn't flashy, but it was honest. A pan of this meatloaf meant there would be enough to go around, maybe even leftovers for sandwiches the next day. And it didn't just feed you, it stuck with you in the best way. The evaporated milk was the secret weapon. Back when fresh dairy wasn't always a given, especially in colder months or tighter budgets, a can of evaporated milk sat ready on the shelf, rich and shelf-stable. When mixed into ground beef, it added moisture and creaminess without making the loaf heavy. Crushed saltine crackers took the place of breadcrumbs, not just as filler, but as a deliberate choice. They added texture, just a hint of salt, and made use of something that might have gone stale in the box. The mixture was straightforward: ground beef, egg, finely chopped onion, a generous pour of evaporated milk, and a couple handfuls of crushed crackers. Seasonings were simple: salt, pepper, maybe a dab of mustard or Worcestershire if the cook felt bold. Once shaped into a loaf, it went into the oven with a smear of ketchup or tomato sauce on top, just enough to create that tangy, caramelized crust that everyone fought over at dinner time. When it came out of the oven, the scent filled the house, rich, meaty, and a little bit sweet from the topping. Sliced thick or thin, it landed on plates next to mashed potatoes, canned green beans, or whatever else the pantry provided. There was nothing trendy about it, but that's what made it special. It was dependable, delicious, and built from things you already had. In today's world of fancy food and fleeting trends, this old-school meatloaf is a quiet reminder that some of the best meals are the ones that don't try too hard. They just show up, taste like home, and keep you full. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. There's a kind of comfort that only comes from a plate of mashed potatoes smothered in hamburger gravy. It's not glamorous, and it never tried to be, but for families stretching $1, this dish was a weeknight miracle. Simple, hearty, and made entirely from pantry staples, it fed hungry mouths with warmth and no small amount of satisfaction. If you grew up with it, you remember that first forkful. Creamy potatoes giving way to savory beef and gravy that soaked into every bite like love poured from a ladle. The base started with ground beef, browned slowly in a skillet until the edges crisped and the fat rendered down. Onions were usually added, chopped fine, cooked just long enough to turn translucent. Then came the flour, stirred in and cooked until it soaked up the fat and coated the beef in a golden paste. The milk or broth followed, whisked in gradually, transforming the roux into a smooth, thick gravy that bubbled softly as it came together. It didn't need much else, just salt, pepper, and maybe a pinch of garlic powder or a splash of Worcestershire for depth. Meanwhile, the mashed potatoes waited, hot, fluffy, and generous. Often they were made from scratch with butter and canned milk, though instant worked in a pinch. Piled onto a plate with a shallow well in the center, they became the perfect canvas. The hamburger gravy was ladled over the top until it ran down the sides, pooling around the base in a way that promised not a drop would go to waste. There was nothing fancy about this dish, But that was its power. It was economical, satisfying, and completely unpretentious. A meal that felt like a reward after a long day, even if it cost next to nothing. In a world full of complicated recipes and takeout apps, hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes reminds us that sometimes the best dinners are the simplest ones. Just beef, potatoes, and the kind of gravy that made even the worst days feel a little bit better. Beef macaroni bake, precursor to hamburger helper. Before hamburger helper came in a cheerful box with powdered cheese and a cartoon glove, there was the homemade version, beef macaroni bake. It was born in kitchens where mothers didn't need step-by-step instructions. They just needed dinner on the table, fast and filling. This casserole was hearty, dependable, and made from ingredients already tucked away in the pantry. It was what you made when you had a pound of ground beef, a handful of elbow macaroni, and a hungry family waiting with forks in hand. The beef was browned first, often with diced onion and a little garlic if you had it. Then came the tomato, usually canned tomato sauce, sometimes crushed tomatoes, or even tomato soup in a pinch. The sauce would bubble gently while the macaroni cooked separately, often just to al dente, so it didn't turn to mush in the oven. The two came together in a big mixing bowl or straight into the baking dish, stirred with a touch of milk or broth to loosen it up. A handful of shredded cheese was tossed in if it was available, cheddar, American, or whatever was hiding in the fridge. If not, no one complained. Poured into a casserole dish and topped with breadcrumbs, grated cheese, or nothing at all, it baked until bubbly and just crisp at the edges. The result was pure comfort, soft pasta, savory beef, and that unmistakable tomato tang. It wasn't fussy, and it wasn't meant to be. It filled plates, stretched $1, and tasted even better the next day, reheated in a skillet or scooped cold from the fridge by a teenager with no patience. Beef macaroni. Bake was the kind of meal that anchored weeknights and fed second helpings without a second thought. It didn't need branding or instructions. It just needed a casserole dish, an oven, and someone who knew how to turn a few humble ingredients into something that tasted like home. Long before box dinners promised convenience, this dish quietly delivered it. Warm, filling, and exactly what everyone needed at the end of a long day. Ground beef, tater tot hottish, Midwestern royalty. In the Midwest, the word hottish doesn't just describe a meal, it's a way of life. And if there's one version that reigns supreme, it's the ground beef, tater tot hottish. Equal parts comfort, food, and community tradition. This casserole has shown up at more potlucks, funeral lunches, and weeknight tables than just about any other dish in the region. It's simple, hearty, and built from a sacred trinity of ground beef, canned soup, and golden tater tots lined up like little soldiers. The base of the dish is browned ground beef, often seasoned with salt, pepper, and chopped onions. Once cooked, it's mixed with cream of mushroom soup, or cream of chicken, if that's what the pantry offered, and maybe a handful of frozen peas, corn, or green beans for good measure. It's not fancy, and it doesn't try to be. The goal is comfort, not complexity. The mixture gets poured into a casserole dish, smoothed out, and then comes the best part, the tater tots. Tater tots aren't just a topping, they're the crown. Arranged neatly, or sometimes haphazardly, across the top, they turn crisp and golden in the oven, while the beefy filling bubbles underneath. The result is a dish with soft, savory layers on the bottom and a crunchy, salty crust on top. Every bite is a little bit of everything, held together by the kind of unapologetic richness that can only come from canned soup and starch. It's the kind of meal that doesn't need tweaking. Sure, some families added cheese or hot sauce, others layered it with love and a strict sense of symmetry, but the heart of the dish stayed the same. It fed a crowd, it traveled well, It made leftovers people actually looked forward to. In a world of gourmet casseroles and ironic reinventions, ground beef, tater tot hottish, stands tall, an enduring monument to practicality, comfort, and a region that knows exactly how to do dinner. Depression tacos, fried tortilla plus seasoned beef, no cheese in sight. Before tacos became Instagram famous with loaded toppings and gourmet shells, there were depression tacos, bare bones, no nonsense, and deeply satisfying. Born out of necessity during the Great Depression and carried through by working-class families, these tacos had no fancy fixings, no artisan salsa, and certainly no cheese. But they had heart, flavor, and the kind of crunch that made them unforgettable. The tortilla, usually corn, was fried in lard or leftover bacon grease until golden, just pliable enough to fold but crisp enough to hold shape. You didn't bake them or buy them pre-formed. You made them yourself, one at a time, standing over a hot pan with a fork in hand. The beef, usually a small amount stretched with onions, maybe breadcrumbs or even chopped potatoes, was browned and seasoned simply. Salt, pepper, and if you were lucky, some chili powder or cumin gave it a kick. It wasn't about heat, it was about depth, about making the meat taste like more than it was. The meat went straight into the fried shell, maybe with a spoonful of chopped onion or shredded lettuce if the garden had produced that week. But more often than not, it was just beef and shell, sizzling hot and eaten with your hands while standing over the stove or sitting at a crowded kitchen table. No cheese, no sour cream, no guacamole. Those were luxuries most couldn't afford, and the taco didn't need them anyway. This dish was a lesson in restraint. It reminded families that flavor didn't require a dozen ingredients or an overflowing pantry. It just needed care, timing, and a willingness to make do. Depression tacos weren't just dinner. They were a quiet act of defiance against hard times, a way to bring joy to the table when the world outside felt scarce. Today, in an era of $8 tacos and gourmet food trucks, these humble pockets still hold their own. They whisper stories of resilience and resourcefulness, fried to perfection and wrapped in tradition. Sometimes, less really is more. And these tacos proved it with every crunchy, beefy bite. Budget spaghetti bowl, post-war Italian night with canned sauce. Long before artisan pasta and imported Parmigiano became pantry staples in suburban kitchens, there was budget spaghetti bowl, the post-war American take on Italian night, as interpreted by frugal homemakers armed with ground beef, elbow pasta if spaghetti was out, and a can of tomato sauce labeled Italian style if you squinted hard enough. This wasn't authentic, and it didn't try to be, but it was cheap, filling, and just foreign-sounding enough to make Tuesday night feel a little fancy. After the war, soldiers returned from Europe with memories of trattorias and pasta dishes they'd eaten in Italy. The food was simple, rustic, and very unlike what came out of American kitchens at the time. Homemakers, always resourceful, tried to recreate those flavors with what they had on hand. Ground beef replaced slow-simmered ragu, garlic salt, and dried oregano stood in for fresh herbs, and canned tomato sauce, sometimes sweetened with a pinch of sugar or ketchup, became the cornerstone of this domestic reinvention. The meat was browned with onions and maybe a clove of garlic, then stirred into the canned sauce and left to simmer, though not for hours. This was quick Italian. The noodles were boiled, drained, and usually dumped into the sauce to soak it all up. Some families might have served it over toast when pasta was running low, or added chopped carrots to bulk it out. Parmesan? Only if you had the green can. It wasn't glamorous, but it had warmth. It was a little escape on a dime, a way to travel via taste buds, even if the sauce came from aisle 3 and the pasta had been on sale. Kids licked their plates. Dads asked for seconds. and everyone, for a brief moment, felt like they were eating something worldly. Today we might call it pantry pasta, or give it a retro glow-up on TikTok. But back then, budget spaghetti bowl was innovation born of thrift. It was a plate full of comfort that proved you didn't need a passport or a paycheck to serve up something delicious. American goulash, elbow pasta, beef, tomato soup. American goulash isn't Hungarian. It doesn't come with paprika pedigree or slow-cooked stews in copper pots. But in countless American homes from the 1930s through the 70s, and in more than a few today, it was a weeknight hero. Built on elbow macaroni, ground beef, and good old canned tomato soup, this dish was comfort incarnate. It filled bellies, stretched ingredients, and didn't make a fuss, which is exactly why it stuck around. The recipe, if you can call it that, was less about strict proportions and more about what was on hand. A pound of ground beef, browned with chopped onion, a can or two of tomato soup, stirred in without apology, and macaroni, cheap, shelf-stable, ready to swell and soak up whatever flavor was going. Sometimes you added a dash of Worcestershire, sometimes a sprinkle of garlic salt, but always it was humble and hearty. During the Depression and war years, meals like this weren't optional. They were survival. You could feed a family of 5 with just $1's worth of ingredients and still have leftovers for lunch boxes. Leftover spaghetti? Toss it in. A can of corn needing to be used? Why not? Cheese was optional and often absent. This wasn't a dish built for flair, it was built to fill. But here's the thing, it tasted like home. It wasn't exotic, but it was dependable. A steaming bowl on a chipped plate could smooth over school fights, layoffs, cold weather, and tough weeks. It was the kind of food you didn't think twice about until it disappeared, and then you missed it. In today's age of meal kits and culinary reinvention, American goulash might look quaint, but there's something enduring about the way it hugs a person from the inside out. It's nostalgia in noodle form. A culinary time capsule that doesn't care about trends. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of simple magic we could all use a little more of. Korean War era chop suey with beef. In the years following World War II and into the Korean War era, America found itself in a cultural crossroads, and nowhere was that more apparent than in the kitchen. Enter the all-American version of chop suey, a dish that had only the faintest echo of anything truly Chinese, yet became a staple in households trying to stretch meat and add a little exotic flair to weekday meals. This version used ground beef, canned vegetables, and a splash of soy sauce if you were fancy. And despite its shaky cultural authenticity, it filled bellies, sparked conversation, and fed a generation raised on wartime frugality and peacetime imagination. The original Chinese-American chop suey, born in the immigrant kitchens of the West Coast, was already a dish of adaptability. Leftover meat and vegetables stir-fried into a savory jumble. But the 1950s home cook wasn't working with woks or fresh bok choy. Instead, she browned a pound of ground beef in a deep skillet, tossed in chopped onions and celery if she had it, and reached for canned bean sprouts, water chestnuts, or La Choi's pre-packed vegetable mix. A can of cream of mushroom soup or beef broth might get added to stretch the sauce, and a dash of soy sauce, newly popularized thanks to returning soldiers, gave it that international flavor. It was poured over white rice or crispy chow mein noodles and served up as dinner with pride. The result was salty, soft, and warm with a vague whisper of something far away and exciting. Kids liked the crunch of the water chestnuts, and parents liked how far a pound of beef could go. Was it real Chinese food? Not remotely. But it was a snapshot of mid-century America trying to explore a wider world from the comfort of its Formica kitchen counters. This version of chop suey was about assimilation, adaptation, and making do with what came in a can. And in its own strange, hybrid way, it told the story of a country stitching together scraps from different cultures into something familiar, affordable, and just different enough to keep things interesting. Tamale pie with cornbread topping. Tamale pie was never a tamale, and most definitely not Mexican, but it was a Depression-era darling that made do with what the pantry offered and what the budget allowed. A kind of Tex-Mex daydream filtered through American practicality. This casserole was a staple on dinner tables across the Southwest and beyond, especially in homes where frugality met a craving for spice. At its core, tamale pie was a resourceful invention. Take a bit of ground beef, whatever you could spare, and brown it with onions and garlic. Toss in some canned tomatoes, a handful of corn kernels, maybe even some black olives if your aunt from California was visiting. Chili powder was essential, though how much depended on the household's bravery level. Everything was simmered together into a fragrant, bubbling filling, a kind of Tex-Mex sloppy Joe in a casserole dish. Then came the real showstopper, the cornbread topping. It wasn't fancy, just cornmeal, water or milk, baking powder, and maybe an egg to hold it together. But once that golden batter was poured over the spicy meat base and baked until crusty and warm, the dish transformed into something comforting and filling. Soft below, crisp on top, and packed with flavor in every bite. It didn't need cheese, but if there was a bit of cheddar left in the icebox, you'd better believe it went in. Tamale pie thrived in a time of rationing and caution. It turned scraps into supper and just enough spice into something that felt celebratory. Housewives clipped variations from magazines. Church cookbooks printed regional tweaks, and kids grew up associating that golden crust with warmth, safety, and second helpings. Today, tamale pie might be called a fusion dish, or lovingly mocked for being white people's Tex-Mex. But there's no denying its legacy. It was a dish that taught families how to stretch, spice, and save, all in one baking dish. And even now, when the pantry's looking sparse and comfort is in short supply, a tamale pie can still pull you through with cornbread and courage. Beef JellO salad. Yes, with gelatin. Yes, it was real. There are dishes that time gently forgets, and then there are those that history shoves under the rug. Beef JellO salad is firmly in the latter category. Yes, it was real. Yes, it involved ground beef suspended in unflavored gelatin. And yes, once upon a time, someone served it proudly with a side of crackers and perhaps a shredded carrot garnish. It sounds like a culinary dare today, but during the 1940s and 50s, it was considered clever, efficient, and even a little modern. This dish emerged from an era obsessed with convenience, novelty, and the magic of molded foods. Post-war America was in love with gelatin. It could preserve leftovers, make dinners look fancy, and fit neatly into the space-age aesthetic of housewife efficiency. So it was only a matter of time before someone said, "What if we took our leftover beef and made it gelatinous?" The process began with browning ground beef, seasoning it lightly with salt, pepper, maybe Worcestershire, or bouillon if flavor was a priority. Then came the gelatin, plain, unflavored, dissolved in warm broth or tomato juice. The beef was stirred in, sometimes alongside chopped celery, pickles, or pimentos for texture. The mixture was poured into a mold, often a ring because that's just what you did, and chilled until it set. Firm, jiggly, ready to slice. To modern palates, it sounds like a crime against meat. But back then it was practical. Meat suspended in gelatin stayed moist, could be made ahead of time, and most importantly, made a modest portion of beef look substantial. During rationing or tight grocery budgets, that mattered. Beef JellO salad wasn't delicious, but it was a product of its time, when innovation, economy, and presentation often collided in strange but earnest ways. It may raise eyebrows today, but it deserves its place in the culinary time capsule because sometimes history isn't just written in books. It's molded in gelatin and served at a very brave dinner party. Potato chip meatloaf. Yes, crushed chips instead of breadcrumbs. There's a certain kind of brilliance that comes from desperation. Why on and nowhere is that more deliciously evident than in the potato chip meatloaf? Yes, you read that right. In the golden age of post-war convenience cooking, when the pantry was an unpredictable mix of canned goods, powdered soup, and snack food, someone took a long look at a half-eaten bag of potato chips and thought, breadcrumbs are overrated. It was the 1950s and 60s, and home cooks were both wildly inventive and deeply practical. Meatloaf was already the crowned jewel of budget dinners. 1 pound of ground beef could stretch to feed a family if you just gave it the right supporting cast. But when breadcrumbs were missing, stale, or just plain boring, crushed potato chips stepped in like the life of the party. Salty, crispy, pre-seasoned, why not? Making it was as simple as it was satisfying. You'd take your ground beef, crack in a couple of eggs, splash in a bit of milk, maybe some chopped onions or a squirt of ketchup for moisture, and then pour in a generous handful of crushed potato chips. Any kind you had. The chips brought salt, crunch, and a buttery richness that plain crumbs could only dream of. Baked in a loaf pan or free-formed on a tray, it crisped up beautifully on the outside and stayed tender inside, with little flecks of golden chips scattered throughout like a secret surprise. This wasn't health food, it wasn't gourmet, but it was comforting, resourceful, and surprisingly flavorful. Kids loved it. Dads took leftovers in lunch pails, and moms could cross off dinner without a trip to the store. Today, potato chip meatloaf is a nostalgic oddity, half joke, half genius. In a world full of panko and grass-fed everything, it's a reminder that humble ingredients can still deliver knockout meals. And if you ever find yourself with ground beef, a craving for comfort, and a half-crushed bag of chips, you might just be one step away from reviving a forgotten classic. Zucchini beef boats, garden surplus, meat budget. In the long, hot tail end of summer, when backyard gardens start throwing zucchinis at you faster than you can blink, the question isn't if you'll use them. It's how many different ways you can use them before everyone stages a rebellion. Enter zucchini beef boats, a humble yet hearty answer to 2 familiar problems: what to do with all that garden surplus and how to stretch a pound of ground beef across a hungry table. This dish likely floated into popularity during the 1970s, when backyard gardens boomed alongside inflation. Families leaned hard into growing their own produce, and zucchini was the show-off of the bunch. Fast-growing, low maintenance, and way too generous. Meanwhile, beef prices were climbing, and folks were learning to make more with less. The solution? Hollow out those oversized zucchinis, stuff them full of seasoned meat, and bake until dinner looked like it came out of a homesteader's magazine. The recipe was blissfully simple. Have the zucchini lengthwise and scoop out the insides to make space, though thrifty cooks would often chop the pulp right back into the filling. Brown the ground beef with onions, maybe garlic if you had it. Toss in a scoop of cooked rice or breadcrumbs, stir in a splash of tomato sauce, and season it to taste. Then heap the mixture into the zucchini shells, sprinkle with cheese if there was some in the fridge, and bake until everything was tender and golden. The result? A dinner that was frugal, filling, and colorful enough to make you forget it started with a desperate attempt to clear out the vegetable drawer. Kids might have poked at the zucchini with suspicion, but the savory meat tucked inside was usually enough to win them over. Zucchini beef boats have sailed quietly into obscurity in the age of takeout and air fryers, but they still deserve a spot at the table. Because nothing says home-cooked ingenuity like turning garden overload into a wholesome, oven-baked dinner that feeds everyone and leaves no one hungry for seconds. Cream of mushroom beef bake. There was a time when the words cream of mushroom were practically a food group, tucked into every pantry and called upon in times of need. The humble can of condensed soup wasn't just soup, it was the backbone of casseroles, bakes, and mid-century magic. And at the center of this movement stood a dish as reliable as a church potluck, the cream of mushroom beef bake. This was comfort food forged in the fires of frugality and flavored with post-war optimism. The recipe took shape in the 1950s and 60s when convenience met creativity in American kitchens. Ground beef was affordable, versatile, and almost always on hand. Stretch it with a few other ingredients, top it with something crunchy or cheesy, and you had a complete meal ready before the 6 o'clock news. Preparation was no fuss. You'd brown the beef with a little onion, maybe garlic if you were fancy. Then in went the can of cream of mushroom soup, thick, salty, and oddly satisfying. To bulk it out, a starch, cooked noodles, white rice, or canned potatoes. For texture and thrift, you might toss in a handful of frozen peas or those green beans from the back of the freezer. It all got stirred together, pressed into a baking dish, and topped with breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or, if the budget allowed, a sprinkle of shredded cheese. Bake until bubbly, serve with a side of JellO salad, and call it a meal. There's something deeply nostalgic about that creamy, savory aroma drifting from the oven. It's the smell of home on a Tuesday night, of aprons and linoleum floors, of making do and making it delicious. Sure, today's food culture might turn its nose up at canned soup, but there's no denying the role it played in getting dinner on the table, quickly, cheaply, and with heart. Cream of mushroom beef. Bake isn't flashy. It won't trend on TikTok, but it fed generations with warmth and economy, one square slice at a time. And maybe, just maybe, it's time for a comeback, at least on those nights when all you want is something that tastes like the past remembered you kindly. Mock steak. Patties with onion gravy. Back when steak was more of a dream than a dinner plan, home cooks got clever. And then they got generous with the gravy. Enter mock steak patties, a dish that promised the comfort of a hearty steak dinner without requiring you to actually buy steak. It was all about illusion, really. Shape ground beef into thick, oval patties, pan-sear them to get that nice brown crust, and drown the whole thing in slow, simmered onion gravy. Suddenly, you had yourself a plate that felt like Sunday supper, even if it was Wednesday and payday was still 2 long days away. These patties rose to fame during the Great Depression and remained a standby through wartime rationing, then resurged again during the inflation crunches of the 70s. No matter the era, the story stayed the same. Families needed to stretch a pound of ground beef, and flavor had to come cheap. That's where the gravy worked its magic. Caramelized onions, a splash of broth, bouillon cubes worked fine, and flour for thickening. That was the trifecta. If you had Worcestershire or a spoonful of ketchup, even better. If not, salt, pepper, and love did the trick. As for the patties, many cooks mixed in breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, an egg, and whatever seasoning their mother once used. It wasn't just about bulk, it was about tenderness. Then came the sear. Frying those patties in a bit of bacon grease or butter gave them that mock steak edge, crispy outside, juicy inside. Once they were cooked through, they went back into the pan with the gravy to soak up all the goodness. Served over mashed potatoes or white bread, this was a meal that made you feel taken care of, even if the fridge was running low. And despite being a mock version of something fancier, these patties never felt like a compromise. They were proof that a little imagination and a lot of onions could turn the humblest ingredients into a dish worth remembering. Today, they're a tribute to doing more with less and making it taste like more than enough. Canned corn and ground beef fritters. In a world before meal kits and digital grocery lists, dinner was often whatever you could pull from the depths of your pantry, and somehow you made it work. Canned corn and ground beef fritters were one of those make-do meals that turned scraps into something golden, crispy, and surprisingly satisfying. If you had a can of corn, a bit of ground beef, and some kind of batter-worthy binder like flour or breadcrumbs, you weren't out of options, you were in business. This dish found its place in the kitchens of resourceful homemakers during the Great Depression and World War II, when stretching meat was both an art and a necessity. Ground beef was cheaper than cuts, and canned vegetables lasted through the seasons. Fritters, those humble fried cakes, were the perfect vehicle for turning meager bits into something hearty. Think of them as the Depression-era cousin of the modern-day smash burger, with a lot more grit and far less Instagram flair. To make them, cooks would brown the beef with chopped onions or whatever aromatics were on hand. Then mix it with drained canned corn, a couple of eggs, and some flour or crushed crackers to bind. A splash of milk or evaporated milk might loosen the batter just right. Some added a pinch of paprika or a dash of dried herbs, but most kept it simple. The mixture was dropped by spoonfuls into a skillet of hot fat, bacon grease being the preferred luxury, and fried until crisp and golden on both sides. The result? Crispy edges, tender centers, and little bursts of corn sweetness throughout. They were usually served with a side of whatever vegetable needed eating, or maybe just a smear of ketchup or mustard if you were lucky. Canned corn and ground beef. Fritters weren't glamorous, but they were dependable. They filled bellies, stretched dimes, and turned pantry desperation into dinner. Today, they're a reminder that some of the best meals aren't found in cookbooks or five-star kitchens. They're born from resilience, fried in a cast iron pan, and served with the side of get it done. Pizza rice casserole. Everything left over, baked in a 9x13. Pizza rice casserole is what happens when resourcefulness meets a craving for something, anything, resembling pizza. It's a one-dish wonder, born from sheer pantry desperation and the uncanny ability of American homemakers to turn a hodgepodge of leftovers into something that made the family forget, if only for a moment, that they weren't eating the real thing. There's no crust, no fresh mozzarella, and definitely no artisan pepperoni involved. What you get instead is a bubbling, tomato-sauced, cheese-sprinkled dish of comfort that's half pizza, half casserole, and all frugality. This recipe became a favorite during the late 60s and 70s, when casseroles reigned supreme, and no Pyrex dish was ever truly empty. Rice was cheap and filling, ground beef was a weekly staple, and there were always stray bits of vegetables, maybe a lonely jar of pasta sauce, and a handful of shredded cheese hanging around. So you layered them together, poured the mess into a 9x13 baking dish, and baked it until everything was hot, gooey, and lightly browned on top. It didn't matter if the pizza part was more in spirit than in substance. The smell alone could convince a hungry family that something special was on the way. The base was always rice, white, leftover, or freshly boiled if you had a bit of time. Ground beef browned with onion gave it that hearty backbone. Then came the sauce, usually canned tomato soup or jarred spaghetti sauce, sometimes doctored with Italian seasoning to mimic that pizzeria flair. Cheese was optional, but shredded cheddar or the tail end of a block of American could seal the deal. Anything else, olives, bell peppers, chopped lunch meat, was just bonus material. Pizza rice casserole wasn't trying to win any beauty contest, but it won over households for decades. It was warm, filling, and forgiving, a dish that didn't judge you for not having the right ingredients. In a time when meals were made from what you had, not what you wanted, this casserole gave families a slice of joy without, and there you have it. 30 forgotten ground beef recipes that once filled plates, hearts, and wartime stomachs. So whether you're here for the history, the nostalgia, or just trying to figure out what to do with a pound of beef and a can of soup, thanks for joining us. If you love stories from the stovetop of the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your favorite throwback meal in the comments.